I don't really recall a time when I didn't think about becoming an architect or I wasn't doing things related to architecture. I know as a child I was drawing floor plans and elevations, and I even had drawings that I had taken from architects like Ledoux of sort of utopian cities, and so that was just something that has been really a part of my life really from the beginning. I think one of the things about my growing up in my childhood is something that I think my parents recognized in me, and they really helped to support that, particularly my mother. So I was given, books, for instance, on architecture, books on Frank Lloyd Wright, on Louis Kahn, on Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, etc. And so I've always had that opportunity of experiencing it from that standpoint. But no matter where we went on vacation, going to see buildings was really a very important experience in my growing up, and I think it's one of the things that actually helped to sort of shape me as an architect. I started at the University of Utah right after graduating from Ogden High School, and I went with the intention of completing a degree in architecture. That was my hope, at least. At that time, the University of Utah had only one architectural degree, which was the Master of Architecture. And so this was actually by design, something that the dean at the time, Bob Bliss, had indicated was really important to creating sort of a breadth to the education of an architect, that you actually had to have some education in another discipline. I had started out thinking that for my undergraduate degree that I would major in art, and had started in the program in the School of Art there. And during the foundation year of the program, started taking a lot of art and architectural history courses, which were required for the BFA degree. I absolutely loved those courses, and decided to actually switch my emphasis from a studio art form to art history, which at the time was kind of evolving into an actual Bachelor of Arts degree in a newly established Department of Art History. And so that was the program that I went through. That I think is actually, as I said, was something that I had kind of experienced growing up because I was reading a lot about the history of architecture. And so moving into that I thought was really great. And as it turned out, proved to be a really excellent program as I entered into the Master of Architecture degree, not only because there were a lot of complementary courses in that, it did give me a different perception about architecture than I think I might have gotten otherwise, which if I only saw contemporary architecture, I wouldn't really understand how history and really the events in it kind of manifest themselves in the expression of art. And you begin to see over the continuity of all art and architectural history how these streams actually feed into each other. And I thought that gave me kind of a really interesting understanding and sort of a different point of view related to architecture that I think I actually lean on a lot even today. My senior thesis in my undergraduate degree was actually on Italian Renaissance architecture, which, for the most part is actually religious architecture, but it also really sort of helped to inform my idea related to what public architecture, the role of architecture that is designed specifically for people, and seeing how that sort of translated over time was really important. So when I started in the actual master's program, the U was beginning to sort of transition into really, I think, an approach related to what was kind of this, not recently emerging, but probably over the past decade, had emerged as maybe being the primary aesthetic of architectural design, which is postmodernism. And that was a really interesting experience in the school at the time, because there was still a lot of tension between certain faculty members who were schooled in modernism and new faculty member who were coming in, sharing the point of view about postmodernism, which is that they're in some ways sort of naturally in conflict with each other.
Explain how, and give me a date about when.
Well, when I was in school?
Yeah.
So I started the master's program, I think in, 1977. That's when I started the studios in earnest. You actually take, courses in your undergraduate degree. But I started in 77 and I completed my degree in 1980. So that was sort of the period that we were, that I experienced all of that.
And you were in the midst of this conflict between modernism and postmodernism, and with some reflective brutalism. and how
yeah, in the school, in a building.
In the building.
In a building, yeah, that was highly brutalist. So, I recall a studio that was actually co-taught by John Sugden, who is sort of the preeminent Utah, modernist in the international style in particular. And Bob Hermanson, who was a more recent graduate for the University of Pennsylvania, who was really, kind of promulgating this theory, surrounding postmodernism. It was very interesting. We were doing kind of a very large-scale project at the time, which was designing kind of supporting facilities for the Kaparowitz power plant in central southern Utah, at the time. And so actually seeing them as they would, provide, sort of the lectures at the start of the program, at the start of each of the studio sessions, it was kind of interesting to see really how they sort of got along related to that. And in many cases, it was, as they were doing the desk crits, one professor would tell me to ignore the other professor's commentary on the design, because obviously what you want to be doing is something more along the lines of this. I graduated in 1980, and I'm sure...
Terrible time for architects.
And it was a terrible time for architects. There was actually very few, sort of job openings around it. Actually, I was interviewed by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill in my my last year. This is what's called the 6th year of school. They were going around, they were opening a new office in Houston. And Richard Keating, who was a graduate of the University of Utah, was actually doing the recruitment and was going to various schools. And one of the schools he came to was the University of Utah. But what he was actually, the message was, you won't find a job anywhere else. So why don't you come and, and take a position here in Houston? Well, I didn't do that. My plan at the time was actually to go back and do a degree in urban design. But I really wanted to take some time off because I was actually fairly tired of school at that point. I had been going for almost 7 years and nonstop. And of course, architecture school is actually a both mentally and physically exhausting exercise. And so, as it turned out, I was a friend of a friend, or a friend of an architect in Ogden had contacted me, a former teacher of mine, to suggest that I interview with his office in Ogden, which is where I'm from. And so I thought, well, why not do that? I mean, like I said, there weren't an awful lot of job offers out there at the time. I think I had gotten an offer from Ted Smith to join his firm at sort of at the same time, as well as this SOM offer, and neither of them seemed like they would be bigger commitments than what I wanted to have at the time, which was a temporary job until I re-entered graduate school. So I went to work for this Ogden firm, Mathewson and Sanders, and it was actually at the time it was a very small firm. I think there were about 4 architectural staff and a secretary. And, but I really liked it so much that I ended up staying there for the next 20 years. And it was, I think, a really great office for me, actually, because it gave me a lot of latitude, particularly in terms of being able to design. I was able to do, I think, more things than if I had been, engaged in a larger office where I probably would have been drafting, nonstop. So I think that's really one of the sort of the attractions of it. The other thing was, this was obviously my hometown, but I also was able to get engaged in doing a lot of nonprofit work in Ogden as well, which I don't think in a larger city I would necessarily have been afforded. So I became really involved in the Ogden Arts Commission, which was sort of similar to an arts council in Ogden. Actually got to serve as president of that. Began to serve in roles at the Ogden Nature Center in terms of their board, and the Ogden Symphony Ballet Association, and finally the Ogden Planning Commission. And I actually got selected to do that after co-chairing the general plan rewrite that was done, there. So, like I said, I spent 20 years there. I thought it was really a wonderful experience. Don Mathewson, one of the partners, left the firm to go to work at DFCM as a project manager, the Division of Facilities Construction and Management. And Mike and I then partnered, and we then went on to do, I think, some really exciting projects and saw the firm really grow to the point that I left in 2000. I think there are probably some general observations, because I think this is sort of areas that I think I can tell you what I thought they did a really good job of teaching me, which is really how to make the distinction between architecture and building. I thought that was actually a very important learning lesson. On the other hand, I think there are probably some practical skills that I think that might help in terms of, might have helped for me in terms of sort of understanding some of the processes related to the design of buildings. Now, I actually sort of matured during this period when really I think the culture of offices and even the collaboration on design was probably different than it is now. And so, I was working at that time with, fairly mature architects, and we were really working in perhaps maybe a more siloed capacity than otherwise. But it worked for me, actually, because that's where my training was actually in sort of the design aspects of it versus the other side of the process, which even at what became Sanders Herman, I really didn't have the opportunity of actually honing too much on, because I work so exclusively on the design side of a project. To your next question, which is the projects that we worked on. Some of the more significant, one of them, I guess the first major commission that I worked on as a project designer was called the Second District Juvenile Court, which is a brand new building. It's probably about 20,000 square feet. And it was one that actually Mike Sanders brought in because he had had sort of a long relationship with the courts administrator's office for the state. And it was, I think, a very exciting project, and it actually led to us doing maybe one of our larger projects, was actually doing the Second District Court, which is a 12-courtroom building in downtown Ogden, which was sort of a fairly major project in the downtown area. One of the ones that probably is maybe the more significant to me was we'd worked on the restoration of the Egyptian theater. So this was a project that I had been hoping to, I think, work on. I had served on the Egyptian Theater Foundation since 1984, when the building first became under threat of demolition. And probably for the next 10 years worked with this group in terms of advocating for the saving of the building. up to the point that the foundation actually purchased the building outright to make sure that the current owner of it would not tear it down. Shortly after that, the project, in partial response to a RUDAT in Ogden City that took place, I think, in 1987. It was the first RUDAT, which is part of the American Institute of Architects, urban design program. It stands for the Regional Urban Design Assistance Team. This was the first one, and they actually looked at downtown Ogden. And one of the feature projects that they had highlighted was the restoration of the Egyptian theater. So beginning at about the early 90s, this kind of sort of rose to the surface, and there was a really exciting development between Weber County, Weber State University, the Egyptian Theater Foundation, and there was another piece in it, but they all came together, Ogden City, and all four of them came together to not only restore that building, but to expand it into what became the David Eccles Conference Center. So that was really kind of a fairly complex selection process for the architect there. We joint ventured with or associated with Fentress Bradburn out of Denver to work with us on the design of the conference center. Conrad Schmidt, who is a restoration architect in terms of actually looking at the theater itself, and Theater Projects, which is kind of an internationally known theater designer who worked on really taking this old movie theater and turning it into a live theater stage. So we actually completed that. I think it was done in 1997. It was a very exciting project to actually see it from the time that I think I became started with it, which was in 1984, to seeing it come to fruition in 1997. So that was very exciting. Following on that, we did several other, I think, really interesting projects. We did a complete renovation of the Browning Center for the Performing Arts at Weber State University, which is essentially taking what is about 120,000 square foot building, renovating everything except for the two performance spaces within it, the Weber State Alumni House, and one that, a project that in particular I became very close to. I served on the board of the Ogden Nature Center and was able to help them build a new permanent visitor center for them. This was a project that I worked very closely with the executive director, who became a very good friend of mine, Mary Hall, in the development of this project, and we really actually reconceptualized how that nature center would work. That was the first building of what has been really almost a 30-year relationship with it, and EDA just completed a project about a year or so ago, which was maybe about the fourth project that we've done for them, including the L.S. Peary Environmental Education Center, which won several projects for the American Institute of Architects. In 2000, I was kind of confronted with this. It was an opportunity, actually, I think, to buy out Mike in the firm. And so I went through really, kind of a process of thinking, is this something that I wanted to do, was spend the next, 20 or 25 years, continuing to do, work in this particular practice for that long. And I sort of made the decision that, no, I really wanted to try something else. And as it happened, I was approached by a friend of mine who was working at EDA at the time, who said, would you consider coming to EDA? And I thought, well, that's great. I've always thought EDA has been a very important architect in Utah, and I thought this would be quite a different change, to go into a firm that had this kind of legacy piece in it, and start from there versus, continue to build on what Mike and I had achieved already in Ogden. And it also kind of introduced the idea of moving into sort of a larger maybe a kind of a different sort of area of clientele that may afford some different opportunities related to doing design work. So I began there. I'm actually still there 26 years later. I think it's been really, I never really thought leaving Sanders Herman that I would have the opportunity of actually working in a firm that I enjoyed as much as that. But I did, and I found really working at EDA to be a very, very interesting, fun, creative environment, and I've made a lot of good friends in the process of working there.
How was it different?
Well, it's a much larger firm than Sanders Herman, and I think that was different. I think the way that EDA was set up at the time, they were sort of moving into a sort of a studio system within it. There were actually probably, I think, 3 studios. One of them was sort of the recreation studio. There was an interior design studio. And then there was everything else studio. And I was part of pretty much the everything else studio. So I got to do really work on all variety of projects, which is actually, I think, good for me. I like to challenge myself to always, kind of continue to involve my knowledge of, various building program types, different kinds of technologies that might be required for specific kinds of buildings. And so that was actually almost a perfect fit for me in that sense. Yes, well, I think it has changed, obviously, in several capacities. I'm sure that, people are generally aware of sort of the change in just technology, in the way that buildings are in some ways designed and documented, and even now in the way that they're actually constructed. And I think we're going to continue to see this kind of even more rapid, evolution in terms of that. I think one of the things that I think has changed is how sophisticated buildings are now. I think there is an expectation and a demand, really, that buildings are much more needing requirements in terms of environmental systems, in terms of energy usage, in terms of air quality, in terms of just the manner and in terms of responsiveness to various users' needs, etc. And that has really required development of greater expertise and specialization within the field. I think that was probably one of the bigger things that I've noticed in terms of how project teams are actually assembled, is that you really have to look for experts to fulfill certain aspects of a project, because no one person, certainly not the master architect that was sort of the old framework, would be able to actually do any of those things, because you need a complement that is so vast and so deep in terms of their level of understanding of the complexity of the buildings. That sort of puts the architect, who has to actually manage all of that and integrate it into a single building. I think it really requires maybe a lot more sort of understanding of how to manage all of that and to be able to direct and lead in sort of a different way than probably happened in prior years.
How has technology influenced that?
The ability to be able to sort of analyze buildings, I think now we have, systems that can analyze what energy use is going to be, at a very detailed level that we weren't able to do. I think about, like this was an area that we had focused on at Sanders Herman, which was actually designing, being really trying to be more sustainable in terms of architecture. When I worked on the Ogden Nature Center, which was probably in the mid, 90s, it was still a number of years away before the LEED program was initiated, which really I thought was quite a game changer in terms of how one actually had now tools that you could use to sort of organize around. A lot of what you had to do, prior to that was really, you kind of depended on doing a lot of your own research. And although I think, there was mechanical engineers and electrical engineers were probably looking at, the kinds of, energy loads and things related to probably air quality, nothing at kind of the level of sophistication that is now. So, I think we're moving into a period where that's just going to become increasingly the case. But the way in which they can, general contractors now can actually, sort of analyze, material usages on a project. The way that we're now looking at systems to, reduce costs through greater efficiency and life cycle cost analyses and life cycle assessments, et cetera, I think is a lot more detailed, and you just have many more tools that you can sort of rely on that are all technology based. And we'll certainly see when artificial intelligence begins to really move into this area, how that's really going to kind of expand that capability for both good and bad, I suppose. I can't say that I would have done much differently. Like I said, I think I had the opportunity of working in two very rewarding work environments. I've worked on some very interesting projects over time. I've always felt quite challenged in what I was doing. I never felt, a particular need to go somewhere else to find bigger challenges, except coming 35 miles, south from Ogden to Salt Lake, which, but other than that, no, I think I've actually been pretty satisfied with what I've done, and had a good time doing it, so.
Any advice for young architects?
Be adaptive. I think I would sort of say that's what we all probably need to, learn to be. I think it's certainly one of the areas I know that I think has helped me as a designer is one, not coming in with any particular, preconception about how something would be done. But really sort of realizing that what I can do is, one, go through a process of sort of discovery and finding, being able to use that, adapt that into something that was a sort of unique solution for, for the end user. I think that's going to be more critical now as we kind of move into these new sort of unknown periods about, where are we going related to not only technology, but in terms of really addressing these very large, issues, existential issues to some degree, social equity issues to some degree. I think that I think these are areas that, architects, I think, are probably particularly, helpful in terms of resolving, because a lot of it really sort of is going to be the responsibility of doing it because of the field that they're in is going to be, is there. So, but I think we're going to have to just figure out, really step that up and figure out how to solve what are these, I think, are really significant issues, nationally and globally. So, advice, I think your best defense is, continue to educate yourself. I think that the learning curve for all of this is big, but I would not be disheartened by any of that. I think that's kind of an exciting aspect of it, because I know that's a value that a lot of schools do. I know the University of Utah is doing it, which is really kind of promulgating that ethos of being lifelong learners. I think that is really, really critical. And I know that when I kind of even observe, people that I've, younger people that I've worked with over time, the ones that have that kind of innate curiosity, the innate willingness to kind of dig in and, do the investigation, do the exploration, do the experimentation. They're going to be the ones that are going to be able to innovate all of us out of these problems that we're creating for ourselves. A lot of what I'd really like to do is kind of continue to explore doing a lot of this sort of work with the public. I've had sort of that experience in the past, and which is very exciting because I feel that a lot of the projects that I think have really that I've enjoyed the most, that I've felt have contributed the most, are really in the field of public architecture. And that's because I sort of believe that sort of Sam Mockbee, saying, which is, good design is for everyone. We're all entitled to that. It's a right and not a privilege. And I think that's sort of an area where I would continue to want to foster that, even if it was in the role of advocacy. I've tried to apply that in the buildings that I've worked on, both at Sanders Herman and EDA, thinking in terms of who are these buildings actually for, and trying to design around that, recognizing that, that beauty, they're entitled to that. They're entitled to a good, safe, building, and one that actually inspires. And that's really the distinction between a building and an architecture, which is, one is, a building just simply needs to have utility. But architecture, I think, should really inspire. And
how does it do that?
How does it do that? I think it inspires by really helping to sort of transform one's perception about, what it might be utilized, how it might be utilized, of providing, spaces that are, that are delightful to be in, for instance, that are comfortable to be in, that could be going in.
Great example of that. And give me an example of something that is less than inspiring, without dissing any architects.
Oh. Well, I'm not, you wanted to go, what was the restaurant you wanted to go? That's an example of probably an inspiring space. But I think that, among our work, I think you'll see that what we do is we really prioritize, sort of the more public spaces within the building. I think we try to elevate those, give them sort of a sense of scale and openness and invitation, and one to think about how people actually experience the building. And I think about that as in terms of how people approach the building, how people come through the front door, how people circulate within it. Is it intuitive? Is it open? Do you know, and are there spaces with a certain level of generosity in them? I think one of the things that we always try to do is integrate, art into it as well, so they become complementary. I mean, that's part of the tradition, going back, to ancient times, which is really sort of the integration of all those experiences and thinking it about much more of an experiential space where it's not only beautiful to look at, but it's beautiful to hear, it's beautiful to, kind of move through, and the textures are beautiful, the materials are beautiful. And there's a lot in terms of, I think, one of the things we do an awful lot, which is this connectivity to the outdoors. Edwards and Daniels has a long history of doing modern architecture. And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciated about EDA, is really that background in terms of doing that and their commitment to doing that. We actually did a sort of a rebranding about 10 years ago, I guess, where we really wanted to emphasize more our roots in modernism with both, Ralph Edwards and Judd Daniels, who were, among the original modernists in the state. They came from both were educated at the University of California at Berkeley, I think during the time when this sort of Third Bay tradition was going on that had been sort of, taught by people like John Escherick and, Charles Moore and William Turnbull. And what that was really taking the principles of modern architecture, which is this openness, sense of universal space, sort of the simplicity of materials, the kind of the integrity of the structure, but sort of apply it at a sort of a regional level. And I think that's what EDA has really done for a long, long time here, and it's something that I've really, strive to do as we all have at EDA. Well, I suppose that I really did strive to really, to try to make this place better, and particularly for everyone. That this is really about using architecture in a way that can help to shape and change people, for the better, change their perception about place, help to ground them actually in this beautiful environment that we live in, and try to tie them to that in a way by designing buildings that are respectful of that environment. And I think sort of probably the other thing, which is really this, sort of this kind of social responsibility, which is really thinking about how we as architects have kind of unique skill that can be applied to a lot of different dimensions. I've mentioned, some of the areas that I have worked in terms of, nonprofit work, in terms of volunteer work, et cetera, that I think it's actually really enriched not only my personal life, I think it's actually enriched the work that I've done. One of the projects that I wish or that I was very excited about being involved in is the Utah Center for Architecture. This was actually, it's a sort of an affiliated organization with for AIA Utah. It's a 501c3 organization that was started specifically to do public outreach. It had started in one form way back in 1983, I think, with the Utah Foundation for Architecture and the Built Environment as a way of really engaging the public more. It kind of went into abeyance. We sort of resurrected it a few times. Elizabeth Mitchell and I had talked about this, and an opportunity came up when Birch Beale had developed this program called the Utah Architects Project, which was really a means of helping to pull together all of the information on the architects that were active between 1847 and 1949, which was, I think, the year that the School of Architecture started at the University of Utah. So with him and, as I said, Elizabeth and Warren Lloyd, we put together this organization that we renamed the Utah Center for Architecture, revitalized that, and hosted things like the ECTA program, which is a curriculum designed to bring to kids in schools, public schools, probably, in the state. Private schools would be probably welcome to do it as well. Takes them through a coursework that ends up with a project called the Box City, which has historically been held in the Salt Lake Main Library, as well as in some of the other sections of AIA have been held elsewhere. But it really is, about helping all of us better understand the value of good planning, because it's a city, and two, beginning to appreciate the elements of architecture so that we see those, maybe demand those a little more as we're kind of moving into, as we grow older. We're creating, I think, a more sophisticated clientele as well, who will want that, who will expect better design for themselves and for their communities. Would I have done the master's degree in urban design? You know, probably not, although it might have helped me. I mentioned to you that I that we had this route out in Ogden. For the AIA National, their 150th birthday, I think, was in 2007, I want to say. And they did kind of this national celebration of it called AIA 150. I was the champion for Ogden and for northern Utah. And we actually did as one of the projects, because this was kind of part of the initiatives that they were encouraging through the national AIA, we did a design assistance team for Mountain Green. I got to be involved in sort of the design team up there, and I got to meet James Abel, who is an Arizona architect who had been very involved in the AIA, national AIA, for years on their urban design and planning group, as well as the Center for Community-Inspired Design. He invited me to actually be a team member for a national project that he was actually running, that was in Boerne, Texas, which was just north of San Antonio. So for 5 days, I got to work there on urban planning. I was the urban designer. And I think I was actually chosen because I had some sketching skills that James really wanted. But then based on that, I got to do 2 SDATs, which is kind of a sort of a shorter version of it, one sustainable design assessment teams, or what those call, one in Nebraska and one in Pennsylvania. And which, here again, I was the urban designer on all of those things. So I guess, you know, so it actually, I think in the end, I got to kind of realize that. So it sort of complemented my work. I was a 20-year planning commissioner in Ogden City as well. So I understood some of those. And as I said, I actually worked on the general plan up there. But sort of later, I think in about 2016, I was invited to chair the American Institute of Architects Institute Honors for regional and urban design at their national awards. And so I got to actually see and apply, I guess, my discerning, you know, capabilities, such as they are, to looking at these. And these are worldwide projects by internationally famous architects, which I thought was actually a pretty exciting thing. So no, I don't really regret going for that Master of Urban Design. So worked out pretty well otherwise. It is a really rewarding profession. And no matter what role you go into, you know, I think you will probably, you know, find some level of excitement and fulfillment to see these projects actually materialize. But do it conscientiously. You know, think about the implications of the design that you're doing in terms of, you know, society. You know, make sure you make good, responsible choices. So.
Thanks, Bob.